Our talk tonight is Jesus as the new Moses. And so in our last two talks, we looked at Jesus the Messiah as the high priest of the new covenant, for those of you who are here and those who weren't. And so tonight, we'll look at Jesus as the prophet of the new covenant, who perfectly reveals the Father and the Father's will. And in doing this, he's the new Moses. Just as Moses revealed the Father's will for the people of the old covenant, so Jesus is the prophet of the new. And we know in the Old Testament there were three figures who were anointed with oil, with the holy oil, and those were the prophets, the priests, and the kings. And that ointment, that's also called chrism, is the meaning of the word Christ, the Messiah. He was the one anointed with the Holy Spirit. Now these figures in the Old Testament, the prophet, priest, and king, were anointed with holy oil precisely to show the gift of the Holy Spirit that made them sufficient for their mission of being prophet, priest, and king. And Christ, the anointed one, is prophet, priest, and king of the new covenant. And so we've looked at him as priest, and now we'll look at him as prophet in this talk. And hopefully in a future one, we can look at him as king. Okay, so Jesus is prophet like Moses, but yet greater than Moses, as we shall see. And indeed, if he didn't have a prophetic authority greater than Moses, his teaching would be blasphemous, again, as we shall see. And the New Testament brings out this parallelism between Moses and Jesus in many ways. And it's also a fundamental question that any Jew has to consider when he looks at Christianity. What is Jesus' relation to Moses? And also, this theme, the parallel between Jesus and Moses, is one of the great themes of Benedict's new book, Jesus of Nazareth, which I strongly recommend all of you to read. It's a classic. It's a wonderful book. It's not a magisterial document. He wrote it as a private theologian. He says we're free to disagree with it, if we please. But anyway, it's a treasure. And one of the great themes is the parallel, Moses and Jesus, Jesus as the new Moses. In fact, he starts his work precisely with that consideration of Jesus as the new Moses. And we'll see that in a minute. Jesus also speaks of this. In the Gospel of John, in chapter 5, he's disputing with the crowd in the temple, and he says, if you believed Moses, you would believe me, because he wrote of me. If you don't believe his writings, how will you believe in my words? Okay? So we can ask the question, where did Moses speak of Jesus? For those of you who were here last fall, we went through the prophecies. And we saw many prophecies in the 5 books of Moses, but most of them aren't directly from Moses. They're prophecies given to Abraham, to Isaac and Jacob. But Moses does have one prophecy directly about the Messiah, and precisely about the Messiah as prophet. And this is in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 to 19. And so Moses says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brethren. Him you shall heed, him you shall listen. Just as you desired of the Lord your God at Horeb, Horeb is another name for Sinai, on the day of the assembly, when you said, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, or see this great fire any more, lest I die. And the Lord said to me, they have rightly said all that they have spoken. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And whoever will not give heed to his words, which he will speak in my name, I myself will require it of him. Unquote. Right? So that's the prophecy of Moses. And the prophecy alludes to the fact that at the foot of Mount Sinai, on the day of the covenant, of the old covenant, when God came down in the cloud with the thunder and lightning, and he presented the Ten Commandments to the people asked Moses to intercede for them so that God wouldn't speak to them directly, because they were afraid that if God spoke to them, they would die. And so Moses passed that to God, and God was pleased with their request. And so God spoke to the people through Moses, not directly to the people. And so that's what God is alluding to in that prophecy, when in the prophecy of Moses. So the idea is that just as God didn't speak directly to the people of the Old Covenant, he spoke through a mediator, Moses, so too he will raise up a new prophet for a new covenant, and that new prophet will be a new Moses. And him, the people will have to hear and obey, just as they heard and obeyed Moses. Now, at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, when Moses is dying, Moses doesn't enter the Promised Land. He dies in the other side of the Jordan River, overlooking the Promised Land, but he wasn't permitted to enter. And after he dies, the book of Deuteronomy says, "And there has not arisen a prophet like unto Moses." There's not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him for all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all the servants and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and the great and terrible deeds wrought in the sight of all Israel. Unquote. All right, so there was no other prophet like Moses throughout the entire history of Israel. They were expecting a prophet like Moses, but they had to wait until Jesus. They had many marvelous prophets who did marvelous works, but none like Moses, because there was none that was the mediator of a covenant. None of the prophets gave the Torah as Moses had done. None of the prophets took the people out of bondage. So the new Moses that Moses is prophesied would have to be marked by the same features that characterized Moses. In other words, he would have to speak to the Lord face to face, as Moses did. He would have to reveal God's will to the people, as Moses did, revealing the law, the Torah. And he would have to do great and marvelous works, miraculous works, like Moses did when he led the people out of out of Egypt. And he would have to also mediate a new covenant, because that was Moses' principal task, was to mediate the old covenant with the people, which was the giving of the law of Moses. And so if there's going to be a new Moses, there would have to be a new covenant, right? For the new Moses to really be like the old one. And there's another prophecy. We've seen it in some of the other talks. One of the prophets, Jeremiah, speaks of a new covenant that will be realized in the Messianic times. He says, Jeremiah says, chapter 31, "Behold, the days are coming when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, not like the covenant I made with their fathers when I took them out of the land of Egypt. But this is the covenant I will make with them after those days. I will put my law into their hearts. I will put my law within them. I will write it upon their hearts. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And I will forgive their iniquity." Right? So that's the new covenant, will be putting the law not on tablets of stone, but writing it on the human heart. In other words, giving us the grace to put into practice the law that was already given through Moses. So that new covenant will involve a gift of grace and the gifts of the Holy Spirit in order for us to be able to fulfill the law. Okay, so the new Moses would have to be the one to inaugurate the new covenant. Now, this prophecy of Moses comes up various times in the New Testament. It's interesting to look at the times when people allude to this prophecy of Moses. Peter quotes it directly in Acts, shortly after Pentecost, when he and John healed the lame man, the man born lame in the temple. And Peter speaks to the people, and he cites this prophecy, and he says that Jesus is the one. He says, "Moses said, 'The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet from your brethren, as he raised me up. You shall listen to him in whatever he tells you, and it shall be that every soul that does not listen to him shall be destroyed from the people.'" And we can see that the people had this prophecy in mind because when Jesus worked the multiplication of the loaves and fishes in the 5,000, for the 5,000, the people said after the miracle of the multiplication, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." And so they're speaking of that new Moses. And it seems that the Samaritan woman is also alluding to it when she has that dialogue with Jesus at the well in chapter 4 of the Gospel of John. And she sees that Jesus is a prophet, and so she says to him, "I know the Messiah is coming, and when he comes, he will show us all things." And so Jesus says to her, "I am he who is speaking with you." And so there was an expectation in the people at the time of Christ that there would be a new prophet who would be like Moses, who would reveal all things to the people, just as Moses had in his time. And in fact, it even seems that God the Father alluded to this prophecy when he spoke on the transfiguration. At the time of the transfiguration, Peter, James, and John saw Jesus right in the sky with Moses and Elijah. And then afterwards, a cloud came down, and out of the cloud, God the Father said, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." Right? Just as Moses said, "There will be a new prophet like unto me. Listen to him. Heed him." Okay. Now, when we speak of Moses and Jesus as prophets, this may sound strange to some of you, because we generally think of prophets as someone who predicts the future. And Moses didn't give very many prophecies, and Jesus didn't especially give prophecies, although we'll see he gave some. But nevertheless, a prophet is a broader idea than just simply telling the future. A prophet, in the biblical sense, is someone who speaks in the name of God. He speaks for God to the people. He's a mediator, revealing God's will to the people. And he does this because he has a special divine illumination that enables him to see God's will so that he can communicate it. Right? And we see that Moses had that communication, that illumination, because he spoke with God. The Bible tells us face to face. And we'll talk about what that means shortly. Okay, so the prophet reveals God's will to the people, uncovering his hidden counsels, his plan. And this does involve the future, but also the past. For example, the book of Genesis, Moses was given illumination to also reveal Israel's past and mankind's past. But it principally concerns the present, because the prophet tells the people God's will and how they should live their lives. That was principally Moses' task, to reveal God's Torah to the people, his law. So if Jesus is the new Moses, the new prophet, he will have to do the same. But then this leads to a question: how do you distinguish a true prophet from a false prophet? For those of you who were here in the first talk in this series, that was the theme. And we said that a true prophet has to have divine credentials, as it were. In other words, God has to give him something by which the prophet can show that he's speaking in God's name and not in his own. And those divine credentials consist in working miracles, basically. Doing deeds that exceed the power of human nature. And those are principally of two kinds of things: working miracles, as Moses did, freeing the people from Egypt, or giving prophecies about the future, things that only God could know, future events, with a precision and an accuracy. And Moses himself gives that criterion for a true prophet. He says, how can you tell a true prophet? He says, when a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the word doesn't come to pass, well, then he's not a true prophet, and you don't need to be afraid of him. He's speaking presumptuously. And of course, if it does come to pass, that's the sign that he's speaking in God's name. Right? So a true prophet has to be able to show that God is speaking in him by doing works which exceed human capacity. We saw Moses did that in the Old Testament, the miracles. And the other prophets of Israel did it as well. Elijah worked many miracles. But above all, it was their prophecies of the future. Most of the great prophets made prophecies about the exile in Babylon in the 6th century and the return of the chosen people after that exile. And that's what validated them as prophets, because those things came to pass. Now, in an earlier talk, when we talked about these motives of credibility of a true prophet, we said that Muhammad didn't work either one of those signs. Right? He didn't claim to work miracles, nor to give prophecies of future events. And so he's lacking the signs that a true prophet ought to have. That's politically incorrect to say that today. But it's very important for us to keep that in mind. Right? What about Jesus? Does he show motives of credibility? Obviously, yes. Right? He worked more miracles than any of the previous prophets, comparable to Moses. And he gave prophecies also about future events. And those future events were, first of all, his own death and resurrection. He predicted 3 times. The destruction of Jerusalem, which occurred in the year 70 AD, he said, not one of these stones will be left standing on another, and that generation would see it happen. And they did. And again, that was not a prediction that would have been, clever political insight. At the year 30, would have been able to see the destruction of the temple in the year 70. And finally, he gave a more important prophecy when he said to Peter, you are the rock on which I will build my church. Right? On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Because now we see 2,000 years have passed. We have the 265th successor of Peter on the throne of the fishermen in Rome, Benedict, and that prophecy has remained firm until this day. Okay. So let's look now at how Jesus fulfills the prophecy to be a prophet like unto Moses. So, to be a new Moses, he would have to proclaim God's name to the people as Moses did, right? Because that was one of the first things that God revealed to Moses, was his secret name, the name, the Tetragrammaton, the holy name of God that a pious Jew doesn't say. Jesus would likewise have to reveal God's name to the people. And he does that, we'll see, in a new way, by revealing the Trinity, by revealing God as Father. He would also have to give a new law comparable to the law of Moses, but again, new. And a new covenant. Right? Now this theme of Christ as the new Moses is beautifully brought out in the Sermon on the Mount in St. Matthew's Gospel. And it's interesting that this sermon, before Christ gives it, he goes up on the mountain and he prays to his Father all night long. And then in the morning, he comes down, he calls the 12 apostles, he names the 12 apostles, and then he gives the Sermon on the Mount. Right? So it's a very solemn setting, a very solemn sermon. He's just called his 12 apostles. And he begins the sermon with precisely the hope of the new covenant. And the hope of the new covenant is the kingdom of heaven. So he begins with the Beatitudes. And he gives the fundamental attitudes that would have to govern the new covenant. In order to arrive at the kingdom of God, you have to have poverty of spirit, meekness, to hunger and thirst for justice, righteousness, to be merciful, to have purity of heart, and to be a peacemaker, and to have the fortitude of a martyr. And then those are the fundamental attitudes of Israel, of the old Torah, but distilled, as it were. And then, after saying that, he goes on to say that he doesn't come to abolish the law of Moses, but to fulfill it. And then he goes on and he says, he takes particular commandments, and he says, you have heard it said that it was said to the men of old, thou shalt not kill, and whoever kills shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother shall be liable to the council. Right? So he doesn't abrogate the 5th commandment, but he extends it, and he shows its further implications. And then he goes on to do the same with the sixth commandment. You have heard that it was said, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity, makes her an adulteress. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, no rabbi could speak like that. No rabbi could say, it was said to you of old, but I say to you. Right? Because the function of the rabbi is to interpret the Torah. It's to interpret the law of Moses, not to make new commandments or to speak in his own name. And the people understood this, that no rabbi spoke like this. And that's, in fact, what St. Matthew, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, he says that the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he taught as one who had authority, and not as their scribes. Pope Benedict speaks about this in his book, and he has a beautiful line. He says, Jesus' I, in this, when he says, you have heard it said, but I say unto you, Jesus' I is accorded a status that no teacher of the law could ever legitimately allow themselves. And the crowd feels this. Matthew tells us explicitly, people were alarmed, astonished or alarmed at his way of teaching. He teaches not as the rabbis do, but as one who has authority, the authority of God. Obviously, this doesn't refer to the rhetorical quality of his discourse, but to the open claim that he himself is on the same exalted level as the lawgiver, as God. Right? The people's alarm is precisely over that, over the fact that a human being dares to speak with the authority of God. Either he's misappropriating God's majesty, which would be terrible, which would be blasphemy, or else, and this seems, again, almost inconceivable, he really does stand on the same exalted level as God. In other words, that way of speaking, it was said to you of old, but I say to you, was a way of proclaiming his divinity. Even though he didn't say, I am God, he spoke as only God could speak. There's an interesting book by a rabbi and Jewish scholar, Jacob Neusner. A rabbi talks with Jesus. He's an American Jewish scholar. He's written a tremendous amount of books, something like, 600 books, something inconceivable. And one of these books is A Rabbi Talks with Jesus. And he imagines himself to have been at the Sermon on the Mount, listening, but not agreeing. And so he gives, in this book, it's a marvelous book, and Benedict quotes it extensively in Jesus of Nazareth. He uses him as to make a dialogue. And so in this book, Rabbi Neusner says, I'm troubled not so much by the message. In other words, the content of the Sermon on the Mount is perfectly Jewish, right? Nothing extraordinary in what he said, amplifying the commandments. That was a typical thing rabbis did, was to show the implications of a commandment. So I'm not troubled by the message, though I might take exception to this or that, as I am by the messenger. And the reason is that, in form, these statements are jarring. Standing on the mountain, Jesus' use of language, you have heard that it was said, but I say unto you. That contrasts strikingly with Moses' own language on Mount Sinai. Sages say things in their own names, but as an interpretation of Moses, without claiming to improve on the Torah. The prophet Moses speaks not in his own name, but in God's name, saying what God has told him to say. Jesus speaks not as a sage nor as a prophet. Moses speaks as God's prophet in God's name for God's purpose. So how am I to respond to this I, who pointedly contrasts what I have heard with what he says? That's a very interesting reaction to the Sermon on the Mount. And it's an insightful one, because at least he sees this, that Jesus is making a divine claim in the Sermon on the Mount. He's not ready to follow that divine claim, but he at least senses that. And then he has, later on in the book, he has another dialogue in which he imagines he's speaking with an ancient rabbi about Jesus' sermons. And so they have this dialogue, and the master asks Neusner, so what does this sage Jesus have to say? And then he gives an example from the Talmud. in which, and this example, I haven't given it to you here, but in the Talmud, very often they sum up the law. That's a typical thing that rabbis do. They say, well, the whole law can be condensed, well, there's 631 precepts, they can be condensed into 10 commandments, they can be condensed into a dual commandment, the dual commandment of love, or even one commandment to have faith. Right? And so the Talmud goes through this. And so then the rabbi asks, the sage asks Neusner in his imagination, well, is this what Jesus had to say? And Neusner says, not exactly, but pretty close. Did he leave anything out? No, nothing. Did he add anything? Yes. What did he add? Himself. That's very insightful. In other words, Jesus added to the law himself because the law is, in a sense, it's obedience to God. And if Jesus is the Son of God and is God, then obedience to the Torah means following Jesus. And that's what Jesus said to the rich young man. The rich young man came to him and asked him, what do I have to do to be saved? What's the first thing Jesus says? Follow the commandments. What are the commandments? And he gives the 10 commandments. But then the young man's not satisfied. He says, well, what more do I have to do to be perfect? And Jesus, well, if you want to be perfect, sell your things, give them to the poor, and come and follow me. And that troubles Neusner. He doesn't like that, follow me. Shouldn't it be follow the Torah? Shouldn't it be follow God? And so he's saying this to this sage in this imaginary dialogue, and the sage says, well, I guess it depends on who this me is. Quite right. If the me is also God, God the Son, then holiness would consist not just in following the written Torah, the Torah written on tablets of stone, but it would consist in following the living Torah, which would be Jesus, the Son of God. And so that follow me is precisely follow the Torah, but follow the Torah that has taken on flesh, right? That has come down from heaven to earth and is our living Torah. And that's precisely the essence of Jesus' teaching. He is the living Torah in all his life, in all his teaching, in the Sermon on the Mount, and above all, in his passion. But it's not true that now Neusner objects. He says that Moses spoke in the name of God. Jesus speaks in his own name. That's true. But the reason why Jesus can do this, of course, is what he says, that I and the Father are one. And so when Jesus speaks in his own name, he is speaking in his Father's name. And when Jesus acts, he's revealing the Father. So Jesus doesn't destroy or contradict the Torah by legislating in his own name, but rather he shows the heart and soul of the Torah. That's the idea. And that's the purpose of the Beatitudes, to show the fundamental attitudes that perfectly describe Jesus. Right? He incarnated the Beatitudes. And it's also for this reason that he doesn't give detailed precepts as Moses had done. And again, this bothers a rabbi like Neusner. He finds it strange that Jesus didn't give detailed precepts, that he gave these general attitudes. And that's, again, it's a good insight. Jesus' legislation is very different than that of Moses. And there's a reason for that. Now, we said that Jesus, at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, he says, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. But that needs to be rightly understood. And in a previous, for some of you who were here last fall, there was a talk on the law of Moses. And we said that the law of Moses has 3 parts. The central part, the most important, the fundamental part, is the moral law. And that's summarized in the 10 Commandments. Right? That's the heart of the law of Moses, the 10 Commandments, which are summarized in the double commandment of love. But then there are also ceremonial precepts, all of the things regarding divine worship, all the commandments about the feasts of Israel, about the Passover, the Yom Kippur, the Feast of Weeks, etc. All the liturgical precepts, St. Thomas Aquinas calls that the ceremonial law. So that's a second part. And then there's a third part of the law of Moses, which is judicial precepts. They're very specific precepts of what kind of punishment you give a certain kind of crime. If somebody commits adultery, what do? You stone them. If somebody commits blasphemy, there's this punishment, etc. And Moses also gives legal procedures. There have to be witnesses. There has to be a tribunal, etc. That's, we could say, judicial law. Now, what kind of law does Jesus, when Jesus says, I come not to abolish law, but to fulfill it, it's above all the moral law that Jesus fulfills. He doesn't give a new judicial law. He leaves that for the nations and for the canon law of the church. So he doesn't give detailed precepts as Moses had done. And again, there's a reason why. Moses gave precepts for one particular people in one period of their history. But Jesus is the Messiah for all peoples and for all times and places. And you can't give detailed judicial precepts with particular penalties and judicial procedures that will be equally fitting for all times and places until the end of the world. And so very wisely, that was left to the nations. And Benedict points to this as a landmark in human civilization. This is where the first time we see a proper distinction between church and state. The church, a law of God, doesn't legislate all the particulars of civil life. That's left for the temporal sphere. This was unknown in ancient history. It was unknown also after Jesus. And the key example of this is Muhammad. What does Muhammad do? He gives a law, and that law is detailed. It gives detailed judicial precepts, and Muslims call that Sharia law. And their goal still today is to have that imposed everywhere they can in the entire world, if that would be possible. Right? That's the goal of a pious Muslim, to have God's law. And it makes sense. If God gave a particular law, you would want to have it imposed on the world, if you can. But that's not what Jesus did. Right? He didn't give that kind of law. He left that for nations. So I've given you a quote. I'll leave that for you to read yourself, of Benedict, in which he speaks about that and its importance. And so the key thing is this: the concrete political and social order is released from a theocratic law, and is transferred to the freedom of man, whom Jesus has established in God's will and taught to see the right and the good. In other words, he's given us the principles that should be the foundation of a just social order. And he did something similar with regard to the ceremonial law. He didn't legislate a new ceremonial law with all the detail that Moses did, but what did he do? He instituted the 7 sacraments of the church. Right? At the Last Supper, he instituted the Eucharist. He instituted the sacrament of penance. He instituted the priesthood. The 7 sacraments, baptism. And the church, in the course of her history, fleshes that out with her liturgy. And that liturgy can take different forms in different times and places. There are different rites in the church. There's the Latin rite, and there's Eastern rites. And so that's left for the church to do. So in summary, Jesus gives a new law, a new Torah. But that new law doesn't abolish the Torah of Sinai, but it strengthens it in 2 ways. He gives us himself as the living law, the living Torah, the living example of the Beatitudes. And he gives us the sacraments, he institutes the sacraments by which we get the grace to put the law in practice. And so in doing those 2 things, by being the living model of the law, and by giving us the sacraments, and above all the Eucharist, which contains himself and his grace, we're enabled to imitate him. He's the model, and in the Eucharist he gives us the strength to imitate him and put in practice that living Torah. Okay. Now this comparison between Jesus and Moses is also given in other parts of the New Testament, and in the letter to the Hebrews, very interesting. The letter to the Hebrews, and it makes sense, right? Because the letter to the Hebrews is a letter written precisely to Christians of Jewish descent, right? So Jewish Christians who are interested in this question of the relationship between Jesus and Moses. And so the letter begins by comparing the 2. Comparing revelation in the Old Testament to revelation in Christ. And so it begins as follows. In many and various ways, God spoke of old to our fathers through the prophets, in many different ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by the Son, whom he has appointed the heir to all things, through whom he has also created the world. He reflects the glory of God and bears the very stamp of his nature, upholding the universe by his word of power. When he made purification for sins in the Passion, he sat at the right hand of God's majesty on high. Unquote. And so what the letter of the Hebrews is doing is comparing the prophets in the Old Testament, who spoke in different ways, with the prophet of the New Covenant, Jesus, who is the very creator through whom God has made the world, and who upholds the very world with his hand of power. He speaks to us because he's become flesh in the Sermon on the Mount, but at the same time, while speaking to us, he's upholding the very universe in being. So it's a new kind of prophet. In other words, the new Moses isn't on the same level as the first Moses. The new Moses transcends the first Moses. And then in chapter 3 of the letter to the Hebrews, they flesh it out more. Before I get to that, in Moses saw God, but not directly. We'll talk more about that in a minute. He saw God through angelic appearances. For example, when he saw the burning bush, when God spoke to him in the burning bush, that wasn't the very essence of God, a burning bush. That was an appearance. That was an apparition to Moses. And the same thing happened on Mount Sinai. The clouds and the thunder and so forth, that wasn't God directly, because God is spiritual. He doesn't have cloud and thunder and so forth. So God spoke to Moses through angelic appearances, or through some kind of mediation. And then Moses spoke to the people. That's not what happens in the New Covenant. God himself takes flesh so that God himself can speak to mankind in the New Covenant. Right? So it transcends the Old. Then in Hebrews chapter 3, this is taken up further, and the letter says, "Consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession of faith. He was faithful to him who appointed him," faithful to God the Father, "just as Moses also was faithful in God's house. Yet Jesus has been counted worthy of as much more glory than Moses, as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself." Right? Obviously, the builder of a house has more honor than the house. And then the letter goes on and says, every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now, Moses was faithful in all of God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken. But Christ was faithful over God's house as a son. And we are his house if we are faithful to him. And so the idea is this. Moses was a faithful servant to the Lord, faithful in revealing and the revelation that was given to him, revealing to Israel. Jesus is not simply he is obviously a faithful servant, but he's not simply a faithful servant. He's the Son. And therefore, the entire house of Israel is the house over which he is the Lord and heir. And we are heirs too, and sons, insofar as we are joined to him through faith. Okay. Now, Moses' activity as prophet was made possible because he had a special revelation from God. Right? And above all, because he spoke to God familiarly. He spoke to God intimately as a friend. And we see this in many texts from the Old Testament, beautiful texts. For example, in Exodus chapter 3 and 4, the burning bush, God speaks to him directly and reveals his secret name to Moses. That's a very intimate thing to do. That's something revealing friendship, to reveal your secret name. And we see it more clearly still at Mount Sinai, that Moses goes up the mountain, he's covered with cloud, and he speaks with God face to face, the text tells us, in that cloud. In other words, he speaks to him intimately in the cloud. And then after that experience on Sinai, for 40 days, no less, then he comes down and God continues to speak intimately with him in the tent of meeting. And when Moses would go into the tent of meeting, the pillar of cloud would come and stand right at the door of the tent of meeting while Moses conversed with God. And the text, this is Exodus chapter 33. When Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the door of the tent. And the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. A beautiful image. And so we might be wondering, well, I wonder what that was like, that conversation face to face. The same chapter gives us an example of it. Chapter 33 of Exodus. For example, Moses asks God in the tent of meeting to show him, for the glory of God's name, how he was to lead Israel to the promised land. And so he asks God. And then God promises to do this. I'll just read the text. I pray, Moses says, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thy sight, show me thy ways, that I may know thee and find favor. Consider that this nation is thy people. If your presence will not go with me, how shall it be known that I have found favor in thy sight? Anyway, he's asking God to accompany the chosen people, as he had been doing up to that point, with the pillar of cloud and flame, fire. Right? Cloud in daytime and fire at night. And God promised him, so this very thing that you have spoken I will do, for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name. Again, that intimacy. So that's an example of Moses' speaking with God face to face. But nevertheless, we see here that even though Moses speaks with God face to face, apparently, he doesn't fully see God. He doesn't see the essence of God because he still has to ask questions. He has to ask God to show him his will. That means that he doesn't see that will. He needs to ask. And so even though the scripture says he spoke to God face to face, that doesn't mean that he saw God as the blessed do in heaven today. Moses didn't, because he had to ask questions. He had to question God. So he didn't have the beatific, we call that the beatific vision. That's the essence of heaven, to see God face to face, what the blessed have in heaven. Moses didn't yet have that. He had infused knowledge of God in this prayer, but nevertheless he couldn't see God. And we see this, so he was in a certain obscurity, the obscurity of faith, which we also have to a larger degree. But nevertheless, the prophet in the Old Testament is still within faith. He has to have faith in God because he can't yet see him. And that obscurity perhaps is symbolized in the fact that Moses speaks to God in a cloud. Right? There's a cloud is a symbol of a certain obscurity. And we can see it even more clearly by the fact that Moses, after this conversation, after speaking with God face to face, he makes a request of God. He asks God to show me your glory. This is the same chapter, Exodus 33, verses 18 to 23. And God replies that he cannot. That no man can see him, his glory, and live. In other words, it's impossible to see God face to face in the beatific vision in this life for a mere man. But nevertheless, God doesn't want to completely reject his request. And so he promised to show him his backside. So let's just read that. So Moses says, I pray thee, show me thy glory. God says, I will make my goodness pass before you. I will proclaim before you my name, the Lord, which is the sacred name, Yahweh. I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious. I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. But you cannot see my face. For man shall not see me and live. And the Lord said, behold, there's a place by me where you shall stand upon this rock. And when my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. And then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back. But my face shall not be seen. Unquote. A very curious passage. And so what's being told to us? That Moses didn't see God face to face. That wasn't permitted him. But he had a knowledge of God that exceeded what we can have through our human powers. In other words, he received a special infused prophetic gift. But nevertheless, not the fullness that we still await in heaven. St. Paul speaks of this in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 13. It's the same chapter where he has the hymn on love. And he concludes that chapter on love by speaking about the beatific vision. He says, our knowledge here is imperfect, and our prophecy is also imperfect. But when the perfect comes, heaven, the imperfect will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. That's an analogy for understanding the difference between prophecy and heaven. For now, we see in a mirror darkly, dimly. But then, in heaven, face to face. Now I know in part. Then I shall understand fully, even as I have been fully understood. In other words, we'll see God even as He sees us. That's an incredible promise. In other words, that's what St. Paul says. We shall see Him as we have been understood. We shall understand Him as we have been understood. But Moses wasn't at that stage yet. So he too saw God through a mirror dimly. Although his prophecy was far more fundamental than any other prophet. And he's the great prophet of Israel. But nevertheless, he still saw through a mirror darkly. Now this brings us to the question, well, what about Christ? Did he likewise see God through a mirror darkly? Or did he see Him perfectly? Right? That's the question. If he's the prophet, and of course we believe that he is, predicted by Moses, it makes sense that he must see God at least as well as Moses, right? And so he must see God in this face-to-face, intimate way, as conversing by friend. Yeah. But when you think about it, the new Moses, if he's simply the same as the old Moses, what would be the point? What would he reveal more than the old Moses? If there's going to be a new Moses, the new Moses would have to see God more fully than the old. Otherwise, there would be no purpose in a new Moses. The old one would have been sufficient. And just as Moses heard God's name, the sacred tetragrammaton in the burning bush, well, the new Moses would have to have a similar but greater experience of God's secret name, so as to reveal that to the new Israel, to Israel and the church. And Benedict addresses this in his book, Jesus of Nazareth. And in fact, it's one of the main themes of the entire book, that Jesus had this a vision of God that's the basis of all his activity. In other words, we tend to be, we live in an activist culture. We're always doing things, and we, Americans don't tend to be very contemplative. But action has to be rooted in contemplation for it to have solidity. Well, if that's true in general, it would equally, and we saw that was true of Moses, right? Moses was incredibly active in what he did. He led the people out of Egypt. But that activity was rooted in contemplation. So the new Moses must likewise have his activity, freeing us from sin, rooted in a special contemplation of God. And so that's what we'll look at now. So Benedict says, although Moses' immediate relation to God made him the great mediator of revelation, the mediator of the covenant, nevertheless, it had its limits, and we've seen that. He does not behold God's face, even though he's permitted to enter the cloud of God's presence and speak with him as a friend. The promise of a prophet like me thus implicitly contains an even greater expectation. The last prophet, the new Moses, will be granted what was refused to the first one, right? To see his glory. A real immediate vision of the face of God and not just his backside. This naturally entails the further expectation that the new Moses will be the mediator of a greater covenant than the one that Moses was able to bring down from Sinai. Unquote. That's Benedict. Beautiful. So how do we see this in the New Testament? So let's start. What is the divine? Does Jesus reveal a divine name like Moses did? Well, not in the very form of a word. Right? Jesus doesn't give a particular word as Moses did with the Tetragrammaton, with Yahweh. But he does reveal us God in a totally new and unheard of way. And that's the revelation of the Trinity. He reveals that God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And we'll talk, this will be the theme of the talk next week. So I won't go into that now. And Jesus is able to do this. Why? Because he himself is the Son. And so he can reveal the Father because he knows the Father as the Son knows the Father. Now the Gospels are full of references to this knowledge of God that is immediate, total, and filial. It's the knowledge of the Son of his Father. And that's what enables him to be the new Moses. John's Gospel, it starts with a prologue, and the prologue is, in the beginning was the Word, etc. And the prologue ends with a comparison between Moses and Jesus. And the very end of that prologue is, no one has ever seen God. The only Son, so not even Moses. Right? Before that he says, the law came through Moses, but grace and truth through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, not even Moses. The only Son who is in the bosom of the Father, he has made him known. So the only Son, yes, he has seen him. Why? Because he's in the very bosom, or heart, we could say, of the Father. And we see this many times in the Gospels. For example, when Jesus is speaking with Nicodemus at night about baptism, Nicodemus comes to him at night because he's afraid to come during the day, and they have this little dialogue, and Jesus tells him about the necessity of baptism. And Nicodemus is puzzled. He says, how can a man be born again? It seems impossible. And Jesus says to him, are you a teacher of Israel, and you don't understand this? Truly, I say to you, we speak of what we know, and bear witness to what we have seen. But you do not receive our testimony. If I've told you earthly things and you do not believe, how can you believe if I tell you heavenly things? And then we might wonder, well, how can he tell us heavenly things? He goes on to tell us, no one has ascended into heaven, but he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man. Which is obviously himself, right? So the Messiah is able to reveal this new law, this new Torah, to Israel, because he has seen the Father. He has come forth from the Father. Right? He's come down from heaven. So that's why he says, I speak of what I have seen and what I know, but you don't receive my testimony. That's in the Gospel of John. We see it likewise in Matthew and Luke. They record this saying, a beautiful saying of Jesus, in which he rejoices in the Holy Spirit, and he thanks God for having hidden these things from the wise and prudent, but having revealed them to babes and simple ones. And then he goes on to say, yes, for such was thy will. All things have been delivered to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son but the Father, and no one knows the Father but the Son, and any to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. And so that's the Son, that's his mission. Jesus' mission is to reveal the Father to Israel because he's the Son who knows the Father. And this makes him the new Moses, the prophet of the new Israel. And he reveals that to those who are babes. In other words, those who have the humility of faith. Okay. I'm going to take this one step further now and make it a little more theological. Theologians pose this question: what kind of knowledge did Jesus have? Just what kind of knowledge was this in Jesus' human soul? So I'm going to follow here the great theologian, St. Thomas Aquinas. And they distinguish, bear with me, 4 kinds of knowledge. The first is proper to God alone. There's the divine omniscience. God knows infinite things, all things, in his eternal present. And Jesus, being the second person of the Trinity, had that, but not in his humanity. He had that in his divinity. But his human soul is finite. He had a human soul, as our souls. And so we can pose the question, well, what did he know in his human soul? Right? So St. Thomas poses this question. He says 3 kinds of knowledge were present in Jesus' human soul. The first is the one that we share with him. Normal and acquired knowledge through experience. Knowledge acquired through experience. Jesus had that also. He learned, he experienced, he was taught by Mary and Joseph. And even the letter to the Hebrews says he learned obedience through suffering, and through his passion, through his experience of life. He learned, in a sense, to suffer in his humanity. And so that's one kind of knowledge that we share with him. And so we can ask, well, did he have anything more than that? Well, he must have, because Moses and the prophets all had something more than that. Prophetic knowledge was a different kind, not acquired through experience, but given from above. And we call that infused knowledge. Infused knowledge is the knowledge that God gives to a prophet, or sometimes to the saints, that enables them to know something that they couldn't have known through human effort. For example, when every prophet, when he reveals future events, he knows that through infused knowledge. Or saints, the Curé of Ars, or St. Pio, they knew the secrets of hearts in the confessional. They could tell the penitent what sins they had forgotten. How did they know that? That's infused knowledge. Right? And Moses had a fullness of this infused knowledge, right? That's what made him the great prophet. And so we can ask, well, did Jesus have this kind of knowledge? Obviously, yes. He would have had a fullness of this kind of knowledge. We've seen he prophesied his own death and resurrection, the destruction of Jerusalem, the church till the end of time, etc. So he would have had that. But then we can ask, well, is this all? Did he have anything more than that? In other words, that would make him like Moses, equal to Moses. Did he have anything that distinguished him from Moses? And the answer of the Christian tradition is yes. Moses didn't see God face to face. He didn't have the beatific vision. But the Christian tradition teaches that Christ did. His human soul saw God face to face from the beginning. That doesn't destroy his humanity. He still had acquired knowledge, as we do. He had to learn in his acquired knowledge, but he nevertheless had something more than we have, and which we hope to get at the end, in heaven, the vision of God face to face. And it was that vision of God face to face that enabled Jesus to reveal the Father. If he didn't have it, he couldn't have even known that he was the Son. Now, this beatific knowledge is far greater than any infused prophetic knowledge, because infused prophetic knowledge is always through the mediation of some concept or idea that God puts in my mind. The beatific vision transcends that. It's to see God in God, not in any concept, because no concept can do justice to God. Right? So no created image can be a likeness to the infinite God. So in order to see God, you have to see God in God. That's the beatific vision. And so it transcends any kind of prophetic knowledge immeasurably. Right? And so Jesus had this. Now we could ask, did any other saint ever receive the beatific vision in this life? Well, John says no one has seen God except Jesus. But nevertheless, I'm just throwing this out. This is a curiosity. In the letter to St. Paul, in the second letter to the Corinthians, he tells of how he speaks of himself in the third person. I know a man, 14 years ago, who, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know, was taken up into the third heaven and saw things that no tongue can narrate. Was that the beatific vision? We don't know. Perhaps. But what we do know is that Jesus had the beatific vision from the beginning of his incarnation through to his passion and resurrection. And the reason for this is because he came to give us the fullness of all heavenly gifts. And there's a principle here. You can't give what you don't have. Right? So if Christ came to give us the fullness of charity, what did he have to do? He had to have it himself first. If he came to give us the fullness of grace, he had to have it himself first. Just like Moses. If Moses had to give to the people of Israel the fullness of knowledge of the law, well, he had to have that knowledge first. And so if Jesus comes to give us not just the fullness of the knowledge of the law, but he comes to give us what? Above all, he comes to give us heaven. He comes to give us the beatific vision. And so it makes sense that he has to have it first so that he can give it to us. Just as he gives us his resurrection. Right? He had to be resurrected first so that he could give it to us. And this knowledge of seeing God face to face would be necessary for him to reveal the Father, for him to be the perfect prophet. He had to look at the Father's face so that he could reveal the Father to mankind as something known, not just believed. Right? Christ the Gospels never say that Christ had faith. That's interesting. The New Testament presents Christ not as somebody who had faith, but as the author of our faith. Right? Jesus speaks of himself not as believing, but as seeing. As I tell you what I see and what I know. And that makes our faith built on a rock. It makes our faith solid. And we see that identity right from the beginning. It's not that Jesus, sometimes you hear, when did Jesus find out that he was the Messiah? Sometimes people, maybe at his baptism. No. He had to have known it all along, because it's true, his knowledge, his experiential knowledge increased throughout his life. But through experience, can you find out that you're the Son of God? No. That can't be something that experience will show you. You can only see that by seeing who you are. Right? And so Jesus had this knowledge. We see it from the beginning. We see it for the first time when he was 12, when he was left in the temple after Passover. Right? His parents go back. Why have you done this? And he says, "Didn't you know that that I should be in my Father's house?" I didn't read that right. My Father, right? Mm-hmm. Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house? So it follows that Jesus didn't have the virtue of faith, right? But something better, vision. And furthermore, this enabled him to see us. And this is very important for understanding the church and for understanding our relationship with Jesus. When Jesus, in his different mysteries of his life, when he was born in Bethlehem, in the crib, when he was left in the temple, when he was teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, when he was sweating blood in the Garden of Gethsemane, did he know us? Did he know me? Right? That's an important question. In his human soul, when he was sweating blood, did he have me before his eyes? That's important for us to know. If he didn't have the beatific vision, he couldn't have known that. But if he did, then he could have seen me in the Word. And St. Paul tells us that in the letter to the Galatians, St. Paul says, he's speaking of Jesus, and he says, he loved me, and he gave himself for me. Well, did Jesus know Paul personally? No. At least there's no evidence that he did. And so it seems to me that each one of us could say the same thing that Paul says, that Jesus loved me and gave himself on Calvary for me, because he had me before his eyes. It wasn't, sometimes we think Jesus gave his life for mankind as if it were a kind of abstraction. But that wouldn't be worthy of a personal relationship. Jesus didn't give his life for mankind, but he gave it for each one of us, known by name and seen. And this is the terrible part. Seen with all our infidelities and our sins, because that was his mission, wasn't it? On Calvary and in Gethsemane, to sweat blood and die for all the sins of the world, seen in all their particularity, in all their horror. But of course, he could also see our good acts. And because we read in when he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, an angel came to console him. So we can imagine our fidelities perhaps consoling him, although our sins causing him to sweat blood. And so that beatific vision wouldn't have been so beatific in Gethsemane, because it enabled him to see all the sins of the world. And that's precisely the abandonment, because he says, my Lord, and my God, why have you abandoned me? That abandonment would have been the desolation caused by seeing all the sins of the world and taking them on himself as his. There's now I'm not making this up, this interpretation, because you don't make up things in theology. They're, at least you don't want to. They're called heresies when you make them up. So there's a beautiful text of Pius XII, Pope Pius XII, an encyclical on the Church, Mystici Corporis, in which he talks about this very doctrine. And it makes sense that it's an encyclical on the Church, because he's talking about Christ's relation to all the members of his mystical body for all time. And so he says that Christ was hardly conceived in the womb of the Mother of God when he began to enjoy the beatific vision. And in that vision, all the members of his mystical body were continually and unceasingly present to him. And he embraced them with his redeeming love. In the crib, on the cross, in the unending glory of the Father, Christ has all the members of his mystical body present to him. You and me. United to him in a much clearer and more loving manner than a mother who clasps her child to her breast, or than a man knows himself. And he had each one of us. And the Catechism teaches the same thing, although in a simpler way. The Catechism says, the truly human knowledge of God's Son expressed the divine life of his person. So the human nature of God's Son, through the union with the divinity, knew and showed forth in itself everything that pertains to God. In other words, Christ in his humanity knew everything that pertains to God through the union of his humanity and his divinity. We call that the hypostatic union. So the Son, in his human knowledge, showed the divine penetration he had also in his secret penetration into the secrets of hearts, of all hearts, and also ours. And so by this union, Christ enjoyed in his human knowledge and the fullness of understanding of all the eternal plans of God that he came to reveal. In other words, this enabled him to be the new Moses, that beatific vision, that face-to-face vision with God. Now, sometimes people make the objection against this doctrine. They say, but doesn't Jesus say that there's something he doesn't know? Right? There's one thing that he doesn't know. What is that? The day and the hour of the second coming. And he says, no one knows the day and the hour, not even the Son. Not the angels, not the Son. So what should we make of that? Well, the fathers of the church deal with this question. And they say, he says that because he didn't come to reveal it. It wasn't part of his mission to reveal that, because we're not supposed to know that. And if anyone says they know that, for example, the Jehovah's Witnesses, right? Right from the beginning, they were making prophecies of the year in which the second coming was to happen, 1914, 1925, 52 or whatever. And they didn't, right? They weren't fulfilled, obviously. Nobody knows that, and nobody can ever claim to know that. So Jesus says that he didn't know it because it wasn't part of his mission to reveal it. And that's the interpretation that the Catechism gives of that line. Right? It's very following the fathers of the church. Okay, in summary, Christ is the prophet spoken of by Moses, just as he is the high priest who fulfills the priesthood of Aaron. In other words, he's high priest as Aaron was priest, but he's not high priest in the same way as Aaron. He's high priest in a much higher way. Well, so too, he's prophet in a much higher way than Moses. And Benedict has said this very beautifully in his book. He says, the promise to Moses, of a new Moses, is fulfilled superabundantly in the overflowingly lavish way in which God is accustomed to bestow his gifts. The one who has come is more than Moses, more than a prophet. He's the Son. And that is why grace and truth have come to light. Not to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. And so Christ fulfills that yearning of Israel to see the Father. And we can see that beautifully exemplified at the Last Supper. One of the apostles, Philip, asks him, show us the Father and we'll be satisfied. And Jesus says, have I been with you so long, and yet you do not know me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father, right? Because Jesus came to reveal the Father. And in that, he perfectly fulfills the role of Moses and infinitely transcends it. So, thank you.